Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Genius Podcast. My name is Karen Doyle, your host and founder of the Genius Project, an initiative for Catholic women designed to support and resource you towards growth in all areas of your life, spiritual, personal and professional. Now, we seek to do this through the Genius Podcast, which you're listening to, our online courses, our live virtual Catholic Women's Summits, the Genius Project Masterclass for Catholic women, and our Catholic coaching programs for women. Now, if you're interested in finding out about any of these initiatives, I invite you to visit our website, www.geniusproject.co, or you can send me an email, karen@geniusproject.co. I'd also like to invite you to join us if you're on social media on Instagram, genius_project_daily, and you can watch the live recordings of these interviews on the Genius Project YouTube channel. Ladies, if you haven't already signed up for the live Virtual Catholic Women's Summit, I invite you to do that by heading over to the website, www.geniusproject.co, and sign up for this free Virtual Catholic Women's Summit. It is going to be a fabulous weekend where our speakers just pour into you formation, encouragement, inspiration, and so much wisdom. Make sure you sign up and keep the dates free, the 20th to the 21st of October this year. Ladies, this week we continue our conversation around this idea of vocation and what it means to be called to live our universal vocation in three different states of life: married life, consecrated life, and the dedicated single life. In today's episode of the Genius Podcast, we're going to be exploring the vocation of marriage and how through this sacrament and this vocation, we are actually called to sanctification and holiness. While this is not always easy, and sometimes we get incredibly irritated by the differences between men and women when we're coming together in this sacred relationship, we unpack some ideas and tips around how we can navigate tricky waters, how we can invest and be intentional in our marriage, how we can cultivate an atmosphere of love and intimacy. To help me unpack this vocation of marriage, I am joined in this week's episode of the Genius Podcast by Steph Ransom. Steph has been married to Patrick for 8 years. They have 2 beautiful daughters. For 10 years, Steph was based in Brisbane, working in Catholic youth ministry with a focus on facilitating programs about love, sex, and healthy relationships for high school students. Steph and her family recently moved to Canberra, and she worked with the Archdiocese of Canberra-Goulburn in marriage and family ministry. Currently, she is finishing a Bachelor of Paramedicine and hopes to continue her love of working with people in the healthcare setting. Steph loves solo car singing, spending time with her family, and a good DIY project. Steph has such a beautiful heart for marriage, which you will see in this interview. She shares some pearls of wisdom from her own experience as well as her professional work working in relationships education. I hope and pray that this episode is a blessing to you. Well, welcome, Steph, to the Genius Podcast. It's great to have you joining us. You're in Canberra, I'm in Canberra, so that's fun. We should be sitting in a room together doing this interview. But welcome. It's really nice to have you joining us.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Karen. It's great to catch up with you twice in 2 weeks.
I know, it's fantastic. So 2 weeks ago, Steph was a guest on the Shalom World TV series that we did for them, and we filmed that in Canberra 2 weeks ago, and that was so much fun, wasn't it? It took quite a few hours. You were our guinea pig.
Oh, it was great though. It was it's a little taste of the media and production world, which I am not in very often. So kudos to you guys. It was so great.
Well, it was fantastic, and we really loved you. You were such a gracious first guest as we all got organised and fine-tuned things. But we're going to deep dive, I guess, doing a bit of an extension of that conversation that we had in Shalom talking about marriage. And on the Genius Podcast, we're going to kickstart this series on vocation and looking at how, as Catholic women, we're living our primary vocation. So we'll be exploring marriage, religious life, and the dedicated single life. So no pressure at all, but you're kicking off this series with reflections on the vocation of marriage. And we're going to be deep diving into that because you've got so much to share and offer us. But before we do that, can you give us a little bit of background about context for who you are and how you came to be living in Canberra and what you're doing?
Absolutely. So I'm Steph. I'm married to Patrick. We've got 2 young daughters. Our eldest just started kindergarten this year, so it's a whole new world from when they're tiny babies and toddlers to starting school. We're in Canberra now. It's our 3rd year in Canberra. So our youngest was born here, which sounds a bit crazy, but she was born here. And prior to that, we lived in Brisbane. And before getting married and kind of being mostly a stay-at-home mum, I worked quite frequently in youth ministry. So I worked for a few different organisations with teenagers at high schools, presenting on topics about love and relationships and talking about the gospel. Also, most recently worked with the Archdiocese here in Canberra in marriage and family and relationships office, which was really life-giving. It was a really beautiful way to settle into a new town, a new archdiocese, to meet all of these fabulous married couples. I facilitated marriage formation programs, so it was a really nice way to meet other people in Canberra because we were new. And at the moment, I'm actually studying full-time, trying to finish off my paramedic degree. So I'm studying to be a paramedic. I'm almost finished. I have about maybe 15% to go.
So close.
It is, yes, so close, but it feels so far away.
You're almost there.
Yeah, almost there. So it's a little bit of a pivot, but I think it's been on my heart for such a long time. My parents worked in healthcare. I've always loved healthcare and science, love bioethics. And so I think I just see it as like an extension of my evangelization call on my life, to work in healthcare, work out in the world with other people who maybe don't know the gospel, but you can witness to them in such a different way. So that's what I'm currently doing at the moment. And then probably maybe 80 to 90% of my life, I'm a mum and a wife, and doing all of those domestic duties and running a household. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And you came to Canberra was it just before the pandemic?
It was before the bushfires, before the hailstorm. So we were welcomed to Canberra with a really hot summer. Yes. Then we had the fires, then the hailstorm, and then our first lockdown in Canberra. So it was a bit of
hopefully 3 years after
by fire.
you start to really experience the blessing and the good parts of Canberra. However, I don't know why you'd move from Brisbane to Canberra because it's so cold here.
Yeah. It was funny actually. My husband's family are all his extended family here, his mum and dad, sister and her family. But I still remember the first Christmas we spent here, and we flew down, and it was cold on Christmas Day. Yeah. And I remember turning to Patrick and saying, "We will never live in Canberra, never." And I felt like we spent almost 8 years, I think, or maybe 7 years in Brisbane. I think that's how long it took for God to soften my heart to move to Canberra. But it's been so beautiful. Yeah, it's been really
has a plan for you here. So.
Yeah, I think so.
Great. We're stoked you're here. And actually, I knew your husband, or I met him. He was like a little boy. So my husband and I moved to Far North Queensland when we were first married and met his parents. So they were a really important part in our life. So it's a small world, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So beautiful. Well, today we're going to be deep diving into marriage and looking at this beautiful vocation that it is. It's beautiful joys, but also its struggles, and what we can do as couples to really, I guess, cultivate the soil of our marriage, because our marriage is called to be a sign and a symbol of God's love in the world. And we often say, if we don't see God's love in marriage, then where are we going to see it? Because this is like really the heart of where we're making visible the invisible mystery of God. But before we dive into that conversation, Steph, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about your first year of marriage. I know for me, we got married. We've been married nearly 22 years. And our first year we hit heads because we were really strong-willed. And I remember looking at all these other couples thinking they're perfect. They don't struggle. They've got no issues. Until it was probably 9 months after we were married, I was sharing about a little disagreement we'd had at a New Year's Eve party. And this girl goes, "Oh, my first year, I cried in the bath the whole first year of marriage. I thought I'd made the biggest mistake." And I couldn't believe it because they seemed like they had it all together. And I think from that moment, Jonathan and I decided to be honest and authentic about our relationship, because we all struggle, right? all marriages have their ups and downs, but it's about growing into a love that's going to last a lifetime. And we'll explore that a little bit. But did you have a similar experience? What was your first year of marriage like?
Yeah, absolutely, Karen. I think I can definitely relate to that first year. We're both quite strong-willed and opinionated and get along really well. But also, I think just that because we didn't live together before we were married, and we had quite a short dating and engagement period. And we were very convicted about discerning marriage, and when it was the right thing, we got engaged, and we journeyed with a marriage preparation couple. And so I feel like they prepared us quite well, but you can't really ever be fully prepared.
No, it's like parenting.
Absolutely, just thrown in the deep end. And so I think my reflection for that first year was we did kind of hit a bit of a we definitely had a bit of a rocky patch. We argued quite a bit. I mean, we didn't really sit down and flesh out, like, very intentionally what our first year would look like what did we want to do, values did we want to hold. We knew obviously we'd be going to mass together, we'd be seeing our friends, but it kind of felt a little bit like we were still kind of living that life. We were working full time, both of us at the time, still living that life, but together in the same house, and not sure how to navigate those small nuances or that everyday relationship that we had as a married couple, just kind of thrown in there. They closed the door and said, good luck, everyone. But I think for me, yeah, it was really similar in that we had a lot of these challenges, and I didn't feel like I could share it with anyone. So I wasn't quite sure if it was normal to be butting heads so frequently, or and I think for me as well, my parents divorced when I was a teenager. So I think that set it set a vision for our marriage. Both Patrick and I knew we didn't want that for our relationship, but we didn't really know how not to get there. So it was more of those practical skills and like things in communication and conflict resolution, or even just expectations around intimacy, family planning, all of that kind of thing. We just felt like we didn't have anyone to journey with us. And I think for me, there was probably a little bit of pride involved in that. I didn't want to share about the fact that we had struggles, because did that mean that we were going to end up like my parents? And I didn't feel like I could share our struggles with my parents, because I didn't want them to know that maybe we were struggling a little bit. So I think for the first year or so, we had a lot of these kind of challenges or struggles, and we'd make up, and that would happen again. I'm like, why do we keep having the same fights about the same issues? And lo and behold, 8 years later, it still happens. But I think it was, once we realized that we needed to bring other people into our relationship, people that we trusted, people that were on the right path or the same path as us, that had good, healthy marriages as well, and just sharing with them about some of our struggles, and just asking for their wisdom, or even just, I guess, that validation that you're not alone. Like, every married couple goes through seasons and times where things aren't as great as it seems on the outside, and I think that helped me to feel not so alone in the walking of the journey. And also, I think as well, when it's just you two at home, no kids are there yet, it can be sometimes, I think, just a very, what's the right word? Very just like intense, I think, because you're having that argument or you're having that conversation. It's a bit heated, and then you feel like it's funny that the lady you said about, she went and cried in the bath. I had many moments where I'd lock myself in my room and I'd be frustrated or annoyed, or and I'm like, what's going on, or why do we keep having this argument, or it kind of turned very dramatic. And then when you share that with someone else and they go, oh, that's so normal, what you're feeling is valid. Not everybody, but it's really common to have those kinds of situations arise.
Out, doesn't it? It takes the pressure out, recalibrate and come back and be productive.
Yeah, absolutely. So our first year was a little bit tumultuous in that way. We also experienced a miscarriage in our first year, and I think that for us, we were quite young, we got married, and it was in the first 6 months of our marriage. And I think that was also a turning point when I realized that we couldn't carry that kind of grief on our own. We had to share that. We had to invite other people in. And it wasn't normal for me, I think, just growing up to be vulnerable about that kind of stuff. So I think even now it takes a lot of time for me to open up with friends about that kind of thing. But it's so life-giving. I think that's the way God intended it, for us to share in relationship with each other about this kind of thing, because we can't do it alone.
Wow.
So
So true.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. It's realizing like marriage actually is a community,
Yeah.
right? And it's a community for the community too. It's doing some of the puberty education talks we do. I've got this script going through my head about explaining, I guess, the marriage relationship to young people. And really, it's this very special friendship where a man and woman form this unique community. And but for any community to flourish, we need others around to support us. And I think you're right. There's, over the past 12 months, I actually know 10 marriages that have broken down, and it's been devastating. Like, it's a huge number. And
Mm.
the impact of that story also on my children, that they see so many marriages, and then if you're irritated with each other, like, are you getting divorced? we were
Yeah.
we were arguing over who was going to do the dishes the other night. You do them. No, I'll do them. No, you do them. And one of them was like, are you having a fight? We're like, no, we're not fighting. But it's funny how I guess the example can really impact, I guess, a younger person, like for yourself as a young person growing up, your view of marriage,
Yeah.
but also the people around us. Like, we have a responsibility to really, for our children, but for all of those that we encounter, to be cultivating
Yeah.
this very sacred relationship. And it's,
Mhm.
it's funny talking about that girl in the bath. I often say at the men's conferences when I'm speaking to them about understanding women, it's like there comes a point in all our marriages. And if you tell me it hasn't happened, I need to feel your pulse, because I don't know anybody who's fully alive where they don't reach a point where, we realize he's not Prince Charming. He realizes we're not Cinderella. We might be ready to throw the shoe at him. And it's that point that, some people turn their backs on their marriage
Mm.
because they say they're not happy or they've fallen out of love, when in actual fact that is the moment when you actually get about the business of building a love that's going to see you through a lifetime. and
Yeah.
and that's what you're saying, and we cannot do that alone. And I think one of your signature messages is that, isn't it, is about really encouraging people to embed yourself in a community of like-minded married couples who can support you and help you grow.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's something that, like, as I get older, and I feel like I can have a little bit more mercy towards my parents' relationship, and what might have happened with that. Um, is one of the things was they didn't have, like, they moved away from family. They didn't have a lot of like-minded couples that were, I mean, they weren't practicing Catholics, so they didn't go to church. They just didn't quite have that community of couples living that, and really fighting for it. And so, yeah, you're right. I think that's one thing that's really, that I've seen our relationship flourish more when we are really intentionally seeking out other friendships that can journey, like, we can journey together and be honest with each other about things, and laugh about the silly arguments that we've had.
Yeah,
So yeah,
so
yeah,
important.
absolutely.
After we were married in the April, and then in the January we went camping down the south coast, and a friend of ours was with us. He was actually a priest, and he had this horrific fall on the rocks, and when the waves came, and cracked his face open, like he was in shock. It was terrible.
Yeah.
And I had to run back down to the caravan park to get the car, and my husband was carrying him. We had to take him to the hospital. But there was this young couple who'd been watching us over the week at the caravan park, and I bumped into them and was like, oh, there's this priest and this has happened, and they helped get the car and get him to the hospital. But they said, we've been watching you. We've been watching how you interact and the books you're reading. I was like, oh gosh. Anyway, they ended up becoming really good friends. They're an Anglican couple. And so we catch up with them each year. But I remember a couple of months after that coast trip, we caught up with them in Sydney, and they sat down at dinner. So we didn't really know them that well. And he just dives in. He goes, so guys, how's your marriage?
Yeah.
And I was a little taken aback. I'm like, that's very personal. But it really
Yeah.
opened this beautiful friendship with this couple where we shared marriage quite deeply. Like, we talked about the struggles, and we really encouraged one another, I guess, towards holiness and on this road to sainthood. And that's really, I guess, the purpose of vocation, isn't it? It's how we live out this universal call to love. So, Steph, I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of theological background about what's happening. Why is marriage so special? It's not just a legal partnership. Like, what sets us apart as Catholic couples?
Yeah, Karen, I think the sacramentality of marriage is such a beautiful reality. I think is the way I would describe it, is that I think sometimes we can see holiness or saints, that there aren't a lot of married saints, and there are a few more coming through the rigs now, but trying to pair holiness and the reality of marriage together can be really difficult. And I think it's so important to continue to make that a reality, the sacramentality of marriage, that we're committing to ourselves, to each other, and to God in this beautiful sacrament, which also means that there's grace available to us at every moment, in the same way in the Eucharist and the same way when we go to confession. There's grace available for us to do better and to love each other better and to love God better. That grace is available to us in our marriage, and it's a particular grace that single people don't have, or consecrated sisters or priests with holy orders, they don't have that particular grace that God intended for marriage to assist us in the journey. And I think because it's an invisible, obviously grace is invisible, I think sometimes we forget that it's available for us, and we forget that we can ask God for that particular blessing, or to really just reach out and grasp that. I think I was listening to a podcast by Christopher West and Matt Fradd recently, and Christopher West was saying very intently that God intended for us to marry our spouse, and for our spouse to marry us, that his purpose for our vocation and his purpose for our holiness, or his plan for our holiness, will come through our spouse, whether we like it or not. And that's God's plan for our lives. And I was reflecting on that a little bit, and a friend was telling me about how, she was just kind of sharing about how God's plan for our holiness and for our sanctification is for our whole lives. And I think that's what I find really beautiful about that permanency of the sacrament of marriage, is that we are forever married to our spouse. Our souls are one with the other. And that if, God willing, we will be married for all the days of our lives, God's plan and purpose for our personal sanctification will come through our spouse. There's no way we can kind of dodge it or get around it. I think that's such a beautiful way in which God has designed marriage and relationship between man and woman. He really desires to spend eternity with us. And for those of us who are called to the vocation of marriage, he will use our spouse to assist us. And I think that we can only be receptive and open to all of those challenges and all of those kind of refining moments that we'll find in the everyday life of marriage. I think it's just such a beautiful way in which God's designed it. And I think that I'll spend the rest of my life learning more and more about how God has designed it, and what he has intended for us personally, but also for our friends and for their relationships as well. I'll always just be in awe of the way God uses each other. For us to become closer to him.
Yeah, so good. I think what you said right there is such a game changer, that this is a path that God has chosen for our sanctification. So sometimes you might look at your spouse and think, you are like going to send me to the pit of hell because I feel so angry with you, or I can't forgive you, or whatever it is. But it's a game changer when we flip our perspective. And I think this is very much what John Paul II was on about. He was always inviting us to shift our perspective, to flip the table on what the culture presents. And the culture penetrates our thinking. Like, as much as we'd like to think we're going to mass and we're immune, we're not. We're really not. Like, that insidious lie that seeps into marriages: I'm not happy, you're not making me happy, you're not this. It's that very self-absorbed, kind of selfish mentality. And we're human, so we get hurt, we're fallen, our spouses have fallen. But really, if we can start to flip the perspective and to really reorient ourselves on this vocational nature, the fact that marriage is a sacrament, the fact that it is through this sacrament that we are being purified, sanctified, being conformed more and more into the image and likeness of God. I think that really does change how we show up in our marriages as wives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, especially in the small moments, and when you're reflecting about things or going about your day, and the way in which we choose to serve our families and our husbands. That perspective is really so important. And I think it's hard too, because I think society, particularly recently, a lot of the more advancements in psychology and understanding how men and women relate to each other, or even just the way our brains work, and if there are different kind of personality styles that can help you understand people better. I think some of that is really good and you can use that, but it's so hard to not it's so hard to then also filter out what is not of God. And so it's almost like you have to be constantly discerning of what you're picking up. And every so often you have to kind of strip some things back and realize they're not serving you, or they're not serving your spouse, not serving our family culture. But yeah, I think it's in those kind of micro interactions where you can choose to serve the other, and you can choose to love them.
Yes.
Choose to kind of throw away that selfishness, which is so easily like put on. It's all those really small habits that allow us to, in those bigger moments when maybe we're not feeling a particular way, or we're feeling really challenged by something, that will allow us to choose the right thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about there really is this act of the will, which is love. And, we often equate love with feelings we feel. We hear people say, well, I've fallen out of love with them. And so they make a decision to leave their marriage based on that feeling. But love, to clarify and to define it, love is actually to will the good of the other. That's what John Paul II talks about love being. Like, it's actually to will another's good and to really help them move towards their sanctification.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful quote by John Paul II where he says, at every moment in history, for its longitude and its latitude, it will depend on who she will be for him and on who he will be for her. And often at the men's conferences, I say to the men, who will you be for the women in your life? And as we have this conversation, I invite the women to reflect, who will you be for your husband, for the men in your life? Yeah. Because he goes a little deeper then, and he says that it's precisely in being in relationship with one another that we discover the essence of what it means to be a human person. And really the essence is to lay our lives down in service and love for another. And so the question is, how are we actually showing up and doing that in our marriages?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing that I really love, or I think that I keep coming back to time and time again, is the individuality of the relationship that we have with God, and that he knows us individually. He knows our spouse so well, and that if we're struggling to know how to love that particular person well, because I think you can read books about marriage, but some of it won't land. Or you can read the 5 love languages, and you can say, oh, my spouse likes to be loved like this, but that might not be true. They might have a different way of loving, or you might be thinking you're serving them in a particular way, and that's a really great thing, and they actually hate it secretly, and they haven't wanted to tell you. And so I think being curious and always wanting to learn and get to know your spouse so that you can serve them and love them in the way which they need, in the way which they're designed, I think is such a beautiful thing. Particularly because I feel like there are plenty of mysteries. There might be some mysteries. There are plenty of mysteries about my husband that I don't know yet, but I feel like there are also things that I don't know about myself, really, and those things can only be revealed to me through prayer and through relationship with God, and our relationship with each other, and praying together as spouses and working on that together and being intentional. So I think, like really practical ways in which you can love them is finding out how they like to be loved or served, or even just finding out some of their hobbies, what are they interested in, what kind of things you talk about at the end of the day. Do they feel like they can share certain things with you? And if they don't feel like they can, or if they're not really sure, like go on that journey of discovery together, setting aside time. I think being intentional is the real key. I think the rest of life for everybody at any stage is just always feels busy. It always feels busy. It feels overwhelming. It feels like we've got so much on. But carving out time together, and also like just sacrificing other things that aren't as important, like prioritizing things, even though there are 2 good things that might be happening. What is the better of the good? Is that serving your spouse? I think some of the skills, particularly that we have used in the past, is doing the Alpha Marriage course together, which is a 7-week program, which is a really beautiful way just to carve out time to do that. And then using the Gottman book, which I know you really love, Karen.
Gottman. So for the listeners, there's a book by Dr. John Gottman, and it's called 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. And in all the years, 20 years of doing relationships education and working with couples, that would be my go-to book. Yeah, it's so good. So you've used it in your marriage?
Yeah, we've read a few chapters together. Our plan that we keep telling each other that we want to sit down and do a bit more of the mapping,
Yes.
the life mapping, and even just the questions, getting to know each other. There's a few really great questions in there that just if we went out for dinner, we could just have a conversation, because I feel like sometimes we get stuck in a rut. We talk about the same things over and over again, but it's nice to just have another tool that reminds us that there are more things that we can learn about each other.
Can you explain the mapping for the listeners? What does the love map mean?
Yes. So the love map, from my understanding, is that you're just you have a lot of kind of questionnaires in order to get to know each other more, and how we can love our spouse better by getting to know them. So,
and even asking that question, and then this is one thing that we can do if we've been married for a number of years, like you do hit that period, especially when kids come along, where it just becomes a little mundane. And it doesn't, it like it does, and we've been through a few patches like that where it gets a bit mundane, and it's really about that word you said, being intentional. So I would encourage women to go to their husbands and say, what are your needs at the moment? Like, how can I love you better? So even to the listeners right now who are married, just pick up your phone right now and text your husband and say, I just really value you, and I want to grow in my capacity for love. Maybe we've been through a rough time, or maybe we've not, but how can I love you? How do you want to be loved in this season? It's so powerful. That just opens a man's heart right there. Instead of being, he gets the text if you're in a hard season and he's expecting a criticism or a nag. To get at that will just open his heart in the most powerful way. I think
absolutely.
there's so many little things that we can do.
Yeah.
Going through different seasons in our marriages.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that reminds me of I had some friends who did, I think it's like a 30-day challenge, a marriage challenge, and it's like they do little things secretly. You do one thing a day, and it's meant in a way to love and serve your spouse, and you're supposed to do it in a way that they don't know you're doing the challenge. I think
love, dear.
Yeah, maybe. I've heard about it a few times and I thought, that would be a really great thing to do. Put it on my to-do list of things. But yeah, it just sounded like I think as well, I think it would be good for me to just stop being so inward. I think my tendency is just to look inward. What do I need? What do the children need? How can I set them up and serve them and love them best, because it feels like they're my focus, especially when they're a lot younger and you're physically like breastfeeding them and changing their nappies and you have to do everything for them. I think we can forget about our spouses a little bit, that they need that love and care and respect from us as well, just as much as the children do. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think men really do need that that nurture from us as wives. And I think because they're so tough and they carry so much, they work so hard, we can very easily lose sight of that. Like, I know Jonathan, every Sunday he'll buy me flowers and he will constantly be cleaning, serving in the house, or if there's no milk, he'll go and get it. So it's a cop-out for me sometimes to think, oh, well, it's just easier for him to do that for me. It actually takes me a lot more work to really think about, okay, what does Jonathan need? Like, how can I actually do something that's meaningful for him? And it's a really good question to ask ourselves, what does our spouse need from us? How can we, I guess, serve? How can we show our love? Because we can say that we love each other, but we need to be showing it regularly. And John Gottman says, it's not the big grand gestures or the anniversaries. It's the small things done consistently each day that actually create an atmosphere of love. So it's not enough to say, I love you. We actually need to be showing that we love, because love is a doing word. We have to do love. How can women, I guess, show love? What are the domains and the areas where we can show love to our husband and cultivate that atmosphere?
I know one of them is respecting our husbands. I know for me, something that took me a few years to learn was like when Patrick will get home from work, the first thing he wants to do is get changed, get out of his work clothes. He needs bit of time to decompress. And often I'll see that moment as he's going to come and straight help with dinner or help with the kids, or great, this is my time to emotionally unload all of my feelings about the day. Also, sometimes because he's the first adult that I've seen having an adult conversation, and also just an external processor, but he's not. And so learning that that's very overwhelming for him to walk into the door with a bit of chaos with young children and me wanting to unload things, and we're getting interrupted, and he's also just had a big day at work and often had challenging conversations or just had a really big day. And so for me to give him time and space to just come in the door, say hello to the kids, say hello to me, go and get changed, get a drink or make a cup of tea. And I think for me, it's really good to just exercise a little bit of self-control. It sounds a bit simple, but in that moment, all I really want to do is just start telling him all of the things that I've been waiting to
do that all day.
Yeah. But I think discerning, is this the right moment to either tell him this or to bring this up? Like, is this the right moment for me to say, can you go out and get some groceries, or can you make sure you put a load of laundry on, or whatever it is? Maybe it's not the right moment, and maybe I could just hold on to that and bring it up another time. So I think be discerning of the moment, particularly because we can be a bit critical of things, or we can request a lot from our spouse. And yeah, so I think that is one way in which I learned to respect him. I think there was probably ways in which I thought he liked to be respected, or things that I was doing that I thought were loving him, but they weren't really like he would acknowledge them and be grateful for those things. But it wasn't what really got to the heart of him and what he really appreciates. Yeah. So learning more about what that is. He's very affectionate. So I think just like receiving his affection is really, I'm affectionate, but not as much. And he's very physical touch and likes to have a hug in the kitchen, or just, yeah. So which has been really, really nice for me. And I think sometimes I just realize I'm like, oh, he just wants to give me a hug. It's not the worst thing in the world to have a husband who loves you and wants to show you that through affection. Like sometimes I'll be like, oh, I'm just trying to make a cup of tea. I'm just trying to do this. I don't need to give you a hug right now. But really it's just him wanting to stop and pause, connect physically, and then go on with our day. And for him, that's really life-giving, and it fills him up a lot. So that's another thing that I've been doing, I think. And that has come from getting to know each other more and getting to know him more about how he likes to be loved and respected.
So the way that we receive love within marriage is quite different. So men receive it primarily through respect, and as women through cherishing. And really, respect is a man's oxygen hose. So what happens in marriage when we get into a dysfunctional pattern and conflict, we start spinning on what Eggerichs calls the crazy cycle. That when a man behaves in a way that's unloving, a woman behaves in a disrespectful way, and it starts spinning. And we can spin ourselves all the way to the divorce courts if we're not careful through that one principle alone.
Yeah.
But it's actually really simple to start spinning in the other direction.
Yeah.
But even when you've been on that cycle, if you can intentionally start to do things that are respectful, it does change a man's heart, and he then wants to be a bit more loving and cherishing. And so I think the ways that we can respect our husbands are through valuing their opinion. I know when we were first married, I'd always know the right way to drive to a location, a destination. And I knew always, this is so prideful, but I know always that Jonathan's way was longer, and it was just going to take it in the longest direction and route, and it would irritate me. I've since learned that when I criticize or when I bring that up in the car, he feels incredibly disrespected, like I'm undermining, I guess, who he is and where he's going. And yes, he's learned to now come to ask for my opinion and direction. So it works both ways, of course. But one of the ways is valuing their opinion, valuing their input, even asking, like even going to your husband and saying, I'd really value your input on this. Yeah. Or I'm having this issue with one of the kids. What do you think I should do? Like that to a husband is an incredible gift. Yeah. Heart. So there's very simple ways that we can respect. I think the other one is our tone of voice and the way we speak as women. And I think our tongue can be so cutting. Like men are far more fragile than we could ever imagine. Don't you agree?
Yeah. And I think that society has done such a disservice to I mean men in general, but in a marriage, in that saying that men are kind of that manly, strong, stone-faced, nothing can penetrate, which is just so not true. And I think I think you're right. That's one thing that that Patrick will regularly kind of speak with me about. He'll say, or sometimes I think for him in our first year of marriage, I'll sometimes get passionate about something, or I'll be annoyed about something that's not really to do with him, but I'm telling him about it, like retelling it. I'm very emotional and my hands are flying in the air, and it took him a really long time to realize that I wasn't angry with him, or I just wasn't angry at him.
Yeah.
And so now he'll go, just checking, you're not angry with me. Or I have to say, I'm not angry at you. I'm just frustrated about this particular thing. But because I don't even realize that my tone of voice and my body language has changed, and he's receiving all of that. He's receiving all of that emotion, which is exhausting for him because he's kind of carrying it and trying to be a good listener and trying to process all of the things that all of the feelings that I've got. But yeah, for him to be spoken to maybe in a bit more of a calm manner, or for me to maybe go away and process my emotions and thoughts and then come to him, and kind of lay it out in a bit more of an orderly way, I think has been something that's really good for me to learn. And I think he's really appreciated that as well. So yeah, I think you're right. The tone of voice and body language, or the way we ask them to do things,
Yes.
is really, it's
And
just,
asking them, like you said, that word asking them, not telling them. I think, nothing shuts a man down more than, I guess, being criticized or being disrespected.
Yeah.
Gottman talks about this, and I really like it. He said, if like men are very resistant to feedback, like because they feel criticized, and criticism is internalized as disrespect. So if you understand that, it can actually help reframe how you're approaching your husband with a request, or with, I guess, a request for change in behavior or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I think what he said is, let's try and listen to the complaint behind the criticism. So whether it's going the other way, whether the husband's criticizing you, it's like, okay, what's the unmet need behind this criticism? What's his complaint? Because there's an unmet need there in the complaint. And I think if we can slow ourselves down and not be as reactive, then we can get to the heart of it and actually grow in intimacy. The sad thing is, so many of us haven't been formed. We haven't received this human formation in relationship skills and education. So like you said, we're fumbling our way through. It's ludicrous that you would take two different people from two different families' ways of dealing with money and conflict and everything, and say, right, now do the happily ever after.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And
And I feel like, so I did a few years of mission work when I was a teenager. So straight out of school, I did net ministries, and they did a lot of this kind of formation of conflict resolution, just so the team of people that you're placed with that year could function well. But I mean, you can apply it to any relationship. So I feel like I did that quite intensely and lived with these people, and we really intentionally resolved conflict and try to communicate well. And even then, I find it difficult in marriage and in relationships to really apply that. And so I think for your average person in society, it makes sense as to why. I mean, it's not a good thing, but it makes sense as to why there are marriage breakdowns left, right, and center. Because really, as a community or as a society, we haven't equipped people who want to get married in the best way possible. And I think the Catholic Church does a really beautiful thing of saying we need to do some marriage preparation, but even then, that regular formation, just of the human person, even just for your own personal development, is so important. Because that is how, your relationship with anyone, but especially your relationship with your spouse, can be, can just be healthy, be as healthy
and to grow too. I often think, we put so much effort into the wedding day, and we think that's the culmination, but it's actually just the beginning. And so we need people to be walking with us as after we get married. Like I often say to the men, like, if you think the chase for the woman's heart ends on the day you say I do, you're going to be sadly disappointed, because that's when you actually have to start pursuing one another's hearts in a deeper way, getting to know one another. And I guess
Mhm.
learning how you can call them towards holiness, which I think is really interesting because, we look at Genesis and we look at that original plan for man and woman in that original experience before sin entered the world.
Yeah.
And a man and a woman were called to come alongside one another to be a helpmate and a
Mm.
complementary partner. John Paul II beautifully unpacks that word helpmate. It's not for us as women domestic goddess and slave. That
Mm.
word helpmate actually means divine aid. So our spouse is placed in our life, like you were saying earlier, to draw us towards Christ and to draw us into the fullness of who we were created to be.
Yeah.
And when we realize that we're actually the ones who are coming alongside our spouse to help them in this process, I think it
Yeah.
does change the way we show up. I think the
Mm.
sad thing is so many people don't know how to do the coming alongside, and that's where
Mhm.
these relationship skills are
Yeah.
crucial.
Yeah. And I think just the complementarity of each other,
Yes.
that we are, yeah, we have to see each other as equal, and we need to acknowledge that our spouse will have gifts in certain areas that complement our own. We don't need to have all of it together ourselves. I don't have to be in control of everything in the household. His input is valid, and it's also really wise. And he's very, yeah, he's very wise. Um, but that it complements me and I compliment him. And that's the way, yeah, like you said, that's the way it's intended, that we're supposed to help each other, supposed to be a team together. And then on a team, sometimes you'll have a leader, which can be the man. Sometimes you have that leader, but I think you can't do it without the other. And that's the way marriage is intended. And I think, yeah, like we were speaking, really it's that refiner's fire, that God always uses the challenges and the uncertainties or those kind of big, difficult, sacrificial moments in our lives to really refine us
Yes.
because of our very fallen nature, to want to do it on our own, or to want to, or maybe even just to think that our spouse doesn't know as much as they think that they do, or that we know better, or we know the best way to to drive, which is funny because we have a very similar argument in the car sometimes. It's funny that you say that.
Oh,
Yeah, that helpmate, that teammate, the quality that we have together. Yeah, we're no better than each other, but we are supposed to complement each other, and I
yes.
think that's a really beautiful
And there's
way.
a real humility in leaning into one another. I think, it's so important. Like marriage is not like a fixed state. Like we're constantly evolving, constantly growing. And so we need to have a level of humility and receptivity to one another to actually make that journey. We were talking, like a couple of weeks ago when we did Shalom about important relationship, what makes a successful marriage. And I think if I could hone it down to one quality, it would be that each person is receptive to growth, to their own growth and the growth of their marriage. And I also want to acknowledge that there are times where, people do need to leave their marriages. So I do acknowledge that through addictions or abuse, there are particular situations. So I want to make the distinction between the conversation you and I are having is for the generally healthy marriage,
Yeah.
not for someone who is in that position, because someone in that position needs help and well may need to separate
Yeah.
from their spouse. But for the generally healthy marriage, I think it's this important quality of being receptive to growth. And
Mm.
some of the marriages that I've seen that have broken down, which I believe could have been fixed and could have walked through this process, is because one person refused to acknowledge, I guess, the stuff they brought to the relationship. And so we both have to acknowledge our baggage because we all have it in a relationship. Someone once said to me, you go into marriage with your eyes wide open and then keep them half closed after that. So we have to be aware of our baggage. But to be really honest with you, 22 years into marriage, I'm discovering and learning about myself. I didn't
Mm.
even know myself when I got married.
Yes.
So, and Jonathan didn't either. And so we grow and we evolve together. And I
Mm.
think that's a very important quality, is just to be receptive, to maybe every now and then go to your spouse and say, I just want you to give me 3 things that if I could do these, they'd be really helpful to you or for the growth of our marriage. Like, what are 3 things I'm doing that hurt you or wound you at the moment?
Yeah.
And then accept the answer in humility and go
Yeah.
away and ask for grace to sort of improve in those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, yeah, you're so right. That area of growth, because growth is never comfortable, and I think that's something that we always will shy away from. Those areas which we are called to be growing in continually. Um, and I think yeah, like you said, having humility, which is also something that we often shy away from because it's not comfortable. Having humility when we receive our spouses, and they tell us, maybe if you could not do this anymore, maybe you could do it this way instead. And receiving that, and if you find that challenging, taking it to prayer and going, obviously we want our relationship to work and to flourish, and if this is what he's told me, I need help in receiving that, because it's a bit challenging, or I feel a bit annoyed about that. But
Yes.
if it's a way in which you can love and serve them and allow them to feel like they can take up space in the relationship just as much as you can, it's really, really important.
And it's making me, as you're talking, I'm having a shame moment. I'm thinking about the petrol in the car. Like, I will drive while it's on orange, like the red light's on, for a long time. Like, it's really bad. Whereas Jonathan will never go below like half a tank empty, ever. He'll always keep it topped up. So many years ago, this became a thing because we were sharing one car, and I would always leave it empty. I'd be like, I knew the next day what I had to do. And I thought, oh, yes, I can get to the other side of town with the red light on. And it would really, for him, he'd get in there and he'd feel like I didn't think of him. Like, it was a real lack of thought. And that converts to a lack of love and respect.
Mhm.
And so I think sometimes it's just showing your spouse that you're being thoughtful. I'm happy to say I am reformed. And now I do fill up the tank, even if it's like 10 o'clock at night and I've realized, I will jump up and go, because I want him to feel like I've heard that and I've responded.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's ways in which we just need to, I guess, ask and then respond, and
Yeah.
even if it's
And
not.
it's funny how at the beginning of marriage, or in the marriage preparation, if you talked, or if someone told you about these very specific things that would help your spouse feel loved and appreciated, I think that I would have just laughed. I'm like, what do you mean? That sounds so ridiculous. But it's so, yeah, it's so true. I think you can never be prepared for it. And I think if you're constantly being open and receptive to those things, because we change as people, we grow, we get older, different things happen in our lives, we deal with things differently. And I think even now, Patrick and I have been married for 8 years, and we're definitely not the same people. Like, we're obviously the same people, but we're so different to who we were when we first got married, that if we're still doing the same things, or if we're still relating to each other in the same way in that first year as we were now, it would have been an incredibly difficult 8 years. Like, we really had to pivot, and even though it was challenging, and even though it's scary being vulnerable with people about things that you're flawed in, I think it's borne so much good fruit. And though, I think sometimes having that hope as well, because it can feel like, oh well, we've just dealt with that issue, now there's another one, or I feel like I've just dealt with this thing in my personal life, and now I've got something else that my eyes have been opened to. I didn't realize I was doing before.
Oh, it's so hard.
Yeah.
Like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So you need to respond, right?
Yes, that's
Two
right.
things I'd love to go into is just like intimacy within marriage. I'd love to chat around that. But as you were talking, I want to make the point that so often these things that we perceive as irritations are actually invitations. And so this is where I see a lot of couples coming unstuck, is they get irritated by each other, and they get really annoyed and frustrated, but they don't realize that in that irritation lies an invitation to growth, to love, and to becoming, I guess, a more healthy couple. So I wanted to make that point before we go into this area. And this area is the one of physical intimacy within marriage. And marriage is a sacrament. So a sacrament is something that makes visible the invisible mystery of God. It's the sign and symbol. Like, the sexual intimacy in marriage is the sign and symbol of the sacrament. Baptism is the water. But sexual intimacy is a sign and symbol in marriage. And so there's incredible grace that is released in the intimacy that a couple shares when they come together in marriage. I'm just wondering if you can speak into, I guess, the need for that and the differences between men and women, because I think there's no greater area that we're different in, that when
Yeah.
it comes to sexual desire and sexual intimacy.
Yeah.
Um, and I think this is an area, especially once kids come along, that can fall right off the to-do list. It doesn't
Mm.
even rank on a priority list anymore for so many women. But for men, it's like one of their top emotional needs.
Yeah.
And we've got this huge disconnect that happens in marriage. I'm wondering if you can speak into some of those differences, and I guess how couples can cultivate a rich, intimate relationship in marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a few thoughts on this. I think personally for us, we had lots of different expectations around this area. It was something that I think we just faced a lot of tension with about, yeah, I think it's more just that growing period as well. And we've had very different experiences of intimacy, relationships and sex and love before getting married. And so it felt like for a while we had to untangle a lot of that while we were married. Um, and I think for me, it was learning that his desire for me, or like a husband's desire for a woman, does come from this really beautiful, holy place. And I think it's a moment for them when they're probably their most vulnerable. And it's also, which also means that a lot of wounding and a lot of hurt can come from rejection if we're not careful about the way in which we kind of have those conversations with each other. And it's funny, in different seasons of our marriage, we've had to really schedule things in or talk about things very intentionally. And other times it's been a little bit more kind of go with the flow. But yeah, I think one thing that I think I was surprised to discover it because I didn't grow up in a Catholic family. I didn't have parents kind of talking to me about theology of the body or even just about the Christian viewpoint of sex and love and marriage. And I had I had a lot of negative experiences with relationships before I was married. And so I think to learn that that Patrick wasn't like the way in which society tells you men are. He was absolutely opposite, but also that there was so much healing that I could find within our relationship if only I let him minister to me and let God into that area, I think. And so I think, yeah, so for him, or for all men, it's that really vulnerable moment in which we can honor them, respect them. And I think as well for men as well, there's plenty of things that they can do in which to learn how to kind of bring it up with their spouses and approach that that intimate relationship. But even on the kind of more not funny side, but the more lighthearted way of, I was listening to another podcast most recently about how for men sometimes it's just they can think about it and they're ready to go. They can just think about, they could be doing the dishes or they can be mowing the lawn. They think about think about my spouse and get really excited and they're ready to go. But for a woman, it often takes lots of those little nice deeds that can often not even be related to the sexual union, be like folding the laundry or cleaning the kitchen without being asked, or buying flowers, or those little kind of moments in which they're feeling loved and cherished. And sometimes it's that slow burn that builds them up to be more open and receptive to their spouse so I found that really, I mean, it's something that but I think just having people share honestly about those kinds of conversations as well can just make you feel not so alone, because I think it's another one of those things, talking about like arguments in marriage and then also talking about intimacy in your love life in marriage is often something particularly Catholics don't do very often. So I think, there are ways in which you can speak about it in really respectful ways and sharing with maybe close friends about if there are particular struggles you're facing, or if there are ways in which you feel like though I feel like I should say maybe start by speaking just with your spouse about it, even though sometimes it can feel like we very easily can do the deed, but talking about the deed is like this awkward thing. But it's kind of similar to getting to know our spouse. The only way in which we can really love and honor them and respect them is getting to know them in that particular area. So it's just another facet of our marriage that we can approach and have a conversation
and
about.
I think I really want to encourage women. I guess once again, I always like to clarify in the generally healthy marriage. to really rank, push this one up on the list of priorities and to be intentional. Like once you've gotten to a bit of a rut in marriage, I think men often stop asking because they don't want to be rejected. And it's not just a physical, biological need. This is an emotional need. So it goes right to the core of them. And I think as women, there's an invitation for us, I guess, to grow and to respond in ways in which we can meet our husbands in this area. And so I would just really encourage women to push that up, maybe to be the initiator.
One quote that comes to mind thinking about intimacy and marriage particularly is that John Paul II says, find yourself when you make, sorry. Yeah, darling, I really need you to go and play in the lounge room, okay? 5 more minutes and don't come in. Quick. Okay, close the door, please. All right, love you. All right. Yeah, so I think one quote that I really sorry. One quote that comes to mind thinking about intimacy and just marriage in general is John Paul II, when he says, find yourself when you make a sincere gift of self. And I find that really resonates with me, particularly in intimacy, is that you can find that love and desire, and you find yourself more when you give a gift of yourself, like mirroring those vows that we make, the freely, fruitfully, selflessly, faithfully, like you're really you're reiterating those marriage vows in that marital union. And I think that we can often forget that. I know particularly, and all of my emotions about being tired and all the rest can kind of overshadow that, but that reminder of we're called to give a gift of ourselves, and God designed sex in marriage to be, like you said, that image of heaven, for him to be so within that. Like he designed that, he created that. It's not society's idea. It wasn't anyone else's idea. And so it makes so much sense that when we allow ourselves to be a gift to our spouse, particularly in that way in which we can both give and receive love in a really free and faithful way, that it can only ever be I guess fruitful. It can be really life-giving. Yeah.
And I love that quote. I can't believe it's almost the end of the episode before we've brought that quote up, because it's so beautiful. But I also read that John Paul II said we were given sexual desire. The purpose of sexual desire is actually to draw us beyond ourselves to and for another. When you think about it like that, I often say, I was having a conversation with one of my children. It goes to an all-boys school, and obviously in high school there's a lot of this talk, and I said to him, well, you can either be a giver or a taker in life. Like your sexuality is a gift, and you can either seek to take to satisfy yourself, or you can seek to serve with your strength and your sexuality. And I think John Paul II really, I love that reminder that it's our sexual desire is there to draw us beyond ourselves to make that gift. And I love that you pick up on that image of the Trinity within marriage. And I started the podcast with this: if we don't see God's love in marriage, where will we see it? Well, as a married couple, you're right. Like God is a relationship of 3 persons in one. We have, that perichoresis, the Greeks call it the dance of love, where there's this constant giving and receiving and finding fulfillment. That's the image that we're meant to carry and embody within our marriage, and that total selfless love. It's so powerful and so beautiful.
It is. Wouldn't it be so wonderful to just sit down and have a cuppa with John Paul II? He's someone I would just just so beautiful, so much wisdom. And I often think if a pope can talk about sexual desire, then in the most holy kind of fruitful way, it's a conversation that the rest of us can have in that in the context of the truth, I suppose.
Absolutely. And I think so important. And so I just love to speak to women today who are maybe struggling in this area. And I know that I've walked with a lot of women pastorally, and there are genuine hang-ups, women that have had negative experience sexually before they got married, and this area, there's a real block for them. Just really want to encourage you to pursue help, to pursue counselling, to pursue healing in that area. And then I know very well that husbands often have struggles in that area too. And so I guess it's bringing it towards and to the right people for help and guidance. And so I really want to end on that note, just to really encourage women if there are issues in your marriage, to go and pursue help and pursue healing. And for people who are in a generally healthy marriage, then just ramp up some of those priorities, learn to communicate and to respect in a way and to love in a way that is received by the other.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you, Steph. You're so full of so much wisdom, and thank you for sharing your marriage. I think it's so powerful when we share, like you said, in light of truth, but we share the pearls and the gems that we've learned from the journey for others. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Karen. It's such a life-giving conversation. I really, having a good conversation with a wonderful woman such as yourself is just really inspires me. It kind of gives you that breath of the Holy Spirit or the breath of the fresh air, and you go, yes, I need to remember to do all of these things for my own marriage as well.
Yes. Well, I feel that talking to you as well today. So let's all go home and love our husbands well. But so for women wanting to go a bit deeper, or women who are having some struggles, I know Megan Kozak with Lighthouse Relationships up in Brisbane offers a great service, and she really does a lot with the Gottman principles in marriage counselling. So I'll put some links to her practice in the show notes as well. But thanks again, Steph. Well, ladies, I hope and pray that conversation was a blessing for you. And if you are married, I really want to encourage you to get intentional about cultivating an atmosphere of love in your marriage. There's so many great resources out there. I'll leave a list of books that I recommend in the show notes, and also to Lighthouse Relationships Ministry. We ran out of time in this week's episode to explore the ways in which women living in other seasons and states of life can come alongside married couples and support them. So women who are single, women who are living consecrated life, there are so many ways in which you can come alongside young married women and really support them and sow into them as couples. I think one of the beautiful ways that we can do this is to get around our friends, find out their wedding anniversaries and send them a text or a card each anniversary. It doesn't take much to get from birthday to birthday, yet we celebrate each other's birthdays. I mean, really, all we have to do is keep breathing. But for a couple to get from one wedding anniversary to another, well, that takes a lot of commitment, takes a lot of dying to self, it takes a lot of suffering sometimes, and a lot of work. I really want to encourage us as a community to start celebrating marriage and to start celebrating and affirming and encouraging one another in this very beautiful vocation. If you are married and if you are going through a difficult season, then I really encourage you to reach out either to your local priest, to some women through the Genius Project, or through the counselling services that are available. Sometimes it takes just a conversation or an idea to switch directions and to reinvest in your marriage. If you're a woman who feels like you're in the early stages of marriage and you have a bit of baggage, then can I invite you to check out the Catholic Women's Masterclass. You can find out more about this on our website, www.geniusproject.co, or there is a link in the show notes. Now, one of our modules in the Catholic Women's Masterclass really deep dives into understanding men, into understanding this vocation of marriage, and how we can learn to come alongside one another. We really look at giving you skills, equipping you with relationship skills and human formation so that you can flourish in this beautiful vocation. Sometimes in our relationships, we can get a little bit stuck. Now, if that's you, or if you're stuck in your own life and you need some help, can I recommend our Catholic coaching programs to you? Here at the Genius Project, we have professionally trained Catholic coaches who can come alongside you and walk with you for either a one-off session or a series of 4 sessions or a series of 12 sessions to help walk you through getting unstuck in some of the limiting behaviors and mindsets and beliefs that might be holding you back, and particularly holding you back in your relationship with the men in your life. So if you'd like to find out more about the Catholic coaching programs, please send me an email, karen@geniusproject.co. Can I ask one last favour before we sign off on this week's episode, that if you like what you're hearing, can I ask you to share the link with your friends and to go onto the Genius podcast platform and leave a review and rating. This really helps to support the work of the Genius Project. Next week, we'll be continuing the conversation on vocation. We'll be deep diving into what it looks like to live the single life and how you can live this season of life with grace, purpose, and joy. I look forward to you joining us again next week. Until then, have a beautiful week and